The G20 or the G2? Oh, how times have changed since 2008 when developed and emerging nations first came together to find common ground. At the time, it was in response to the worst financial crisis in decades. Now, the G20 in Osaka, Japan, could well be overshadowed by the Saturday's sidelines sit-down between the two superpowers that are the United States and China. The rest, all they can do is hold their breath to see if a trade truce can hold, whether it can lead to a deal or descend into open hostility. We'll, of course, ask if Donald Trump's right to take Beijing to task over the security risk of national champions like tech giant Huawei, who are symbiotically tied to the ruling state apparatus, and we'll weigh the pros and cons of barriers and tariffs in this current climate. The other 18 nations in Osaka can also wonder about regional flashpoints like Hong Kong, North Korea, Taiwan. Will they be leveraged as chips in the hard bargaining between Trump and Xi Jinping? And will good intentions on reducing the planet's carbon footprint be reduced to afterthoughts in the name of making money? Today in the France24 Debate, the showdown that's overshadowing the G20. And we're joined from Brussels by journalist Ya-Chun Wang. Thank you for being with us here in the France24 Debate.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Here in the studio, we welcome back Jean-François Di, president of the Asia Center.
Hey.
How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Attorney Jean-Claude Beaujour is vice president of the France-America Association think tank.
Hello, good evening.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And we want to welcome Zhaozhan Shen, political science student at the American University, soon political science graduate at the American University of Paris, president of the Singapore Student Association in Paris. Yes. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
The France24 Debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24Debate. Let's begin with the latest, and the latest is out of Hong Kong. Protesters keeping up the pressure after those recent mammoth rallies against the extradition bill there, which would make it easier to send political prisoners to the mainland. This Thursday, they rallied outside the Justice Department a day after demonstrators marched to the consulates of the major powers taking part in the G20. Recently released Umbrella Movement leader Joshua Wong spoke to France24.
As we know that a few days later is the G20 summit. During G20 summit, I urge world leaders to keep their eyes in Hong Kong because the extradition law, the evil bill, strongly erodes on economic freedom and also the trade between Asia Pacific. In the future, 1st of July is the anniversary of Hong Kong handover. People will join the rally and continue the strike, and we will continue our fight until the day we have free election.
Jean-François Di, let's cut to the chase here. Will Hong Kong be mentioned at the G20, really?
No. Well, it was specifically mentioned by the Chinese part that, of course, anything related to what's called internal affairs in China shouldn't be mentioned. Definitely, publicly, it won't be. As you mentioned, there will be a one-on-one between Trump and Xi Jinping. Trump might say what he wants to say, but I really doubt.
Well, judging by his Twitter feed, his Secretary of State talks about Hong Kong, but him not
Correct.
So much.
Absolutely, absolutely. He kept deliberately a, should I say, a low profile, actually an unusual profile on the Hong Kong matter. But it's very interesting that you showed us Joshua Wong, because I think it's our duty to pay respect to such young people who really stand up in a place like Hong Kong, where they didn't grow up in the previous environment, and then they all realize that it's their turn to speak up, and they were not trained for that. And Joshua is really doing a great job in voicing his own opinion. So I also wonder whether in France we would have such people speaking out for their rights. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Ya-Chun Wang, it's going to be a lot about trade. It's not going to be much about rule of law and democracy, is it, the G20?
I think at the G20, I think you're right. I think Jean-François made a very good point that China wants to remain Hong Kong issue as a domestic issue. It has spoken out to the UK saying that they want UK to stop commenting on what is happening in Hong Kong. And I think the G20, China hasn't been responding so much to what Trump and the Trump administration has been saying. And I think they will strictly want to keep Hong Kong very domestic. And I don't think there will be much discussion about it.
Xiaowan Chen, Joshua Wong, is he an inspiration for you?
Yeah, certainly. I think there are a lot of inspiration you can take from these democratic activities in Hong Kong. But at the same time, we need to remember that the extradition bill originated from the Hong Kong Legislative Council and not directly imposed by the Beijing central government. So there's a lot of questions we have to ask as to what is the democratic process in Hong Kong and how is it related to the power structure in Beijing as well.
Jean-Claude Beaujour, as someone who knows China well, how is rule of law these days, and what's the climate? I would say the business confidence climate.
Actually, China is one country, two systems. In terms of business, it's supposed to be a free trade system. And usually the Chinese government said, we set up legislation in order to organize free competition in China. As far as civil liberties are concerned, I'm not sure we are in the same line. Usually they say, this is our system and we will not discuss that. For me, it's very important that what did happen in Hong Kong, I'm not sure that they did it in order to be on the table of negotiation in Osaka. They just did it to be vocal because they know that this is the best way to be taken into consideration, even as a domestic problem. They know that the Chinese government, Beijing, will pay attention to that because at the same time, the Chinese government would like to be a leader in the free world. This is a real question between the US and China. Who is going to be the first? So they need to be a little bit aware and pay attention to what's going on in domestic matters.
At what point does foreign investment get scared away?
What foreign investments are afraid of is just not to be kept in any political discussion because, sometimes it's very strict with the Chinese government. You are allowed to do business with China through a license. And at any time, they can just turn off the license. So usually the business try to be out of the political debate in China, or at least with China, with the Chinese market, when Chinese market is concerned.
All right, let's talk about Exhibit B. In the build-up to the G20, last week saw the first visit by a Chinese leader to Pyongyang in 14 years. Jean-François Di Meglio, Xi Jinping paying a call on Kim Jong-un. This is about the G20, isn't it, this visit that we saw?
Not sure. You may interpret that like, of course, Xi Jinping wants to get the latest position from Pyongyang to bring up to Trump when he meets up with them and try to find the best way to enter into that dialogue or look-alike dialogue.
But it is leverage, isn't it, a bargaining chip? Because to be able to pressure North Korea, you need everyone on board, including the Chinese.
That's right? One interpretation. My interpretation is slightly different. Of course, China wants to be kept in the game because Trump and Kim Jong-un meeting together definitely seems to kick China out, even though Kim Jong-un went 3-4 times to China, even though he took a Chinese plane to go to Singapore in the first place. But China was kind of out of the dialogue. China wants to be back. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation is that Xi Jinping can carry a very simple message. Just do reforms, just like we did. We don't want you to part away from our camp. We don't want you to be isolated. And we have a recipe for you to make your people happier, richer, and just follow our model. And by doing this, Xi can bring Kim Jong-un closer to him without really, being forced into the dialogue, because he knows for the moment North Korea is very, very difficult to manage. You involve in the dialogue between US and North Korea, and you never know how it will end up, because North Korea is very, very difficult to manage.
And it's dangerous for all the countries around, because we are talking about nuclear weapon. The first countries will be hit are China, South Korea, and
Russia,
and Japan and Russia. So they probably are not on the table at the table of the negotiation, but they know that they are the first one to be concerned about the U.S. North Korea discussion about nuclear weapon.
Yachon Wang, you agree?
I personally think that the reason why China is very outspoken about North Korea, especially today and recently, it's also because they know that Pyongyang needs a friend. And Pyongyang perhaps knows that as well. And in Asia, we have always been talking about Pyongyang being the little brother of China. And I think, in a way, China is putting such relationship in pressure as a leverage to have such political dialogue with the United States. And I do agree with the people at the panel today.
All right, let's talk about then what's going to happen in Osaka. The forecast is for fair skies, if you will, diplomatically speaking. An uneasy truce reported by the South China Morning Post and Politico. Yan Chonwong, will that all end when Donald Trump and Xi Jinping say farewell on Saturday?
I think it has been a very interesting back and forth. Well, there's more of a forth from the Trump administration. I think the Chinese government, they haven't been so vocal as in meeting with the Trump administration as vice versa. I do believe that they are going to meet, but the detail of the dialogue is really to be determined. There will be a lot of hint of speaking about the trade war, but I think the position of how China is going to go about it, China has been making it clear that Trump administration has not been very reasonable about the trade war, and I think this might intensify the talk between the two on Saturday.
Yeah, the United States confirming a robust 3.1% growth in the first quarter of this year. Those figures coming out this Wednesday. So does that mean that Washington's got Beijing over a barrel? Not so, say Chinese authorities.
The US threatened to impose additional tariffs on China, which does not scare the Chinese people. We do not believe this nonsense and are not afraid of pressure. I would like to advise the US side again that to launch a trade war and impose tariffs will only harm themselves and others and not solve the problem.
Is there an amount of bluster and bluff in those words right now? Is China feeling pain?
Kind of. Growth is slowing down. It was bound to slow down anyways. It was intended to slow down because that's how Chinese economy is managed.
It wanted a soft landing.
Right. However, it's probably going beyond what was intended. If you look at the financial market, for example, not the stock market, but the financial situation, well, there is a push to draw down liquidity. This is also an intended push because you had lots of shadow banking in China, and there is an intended push to kill the shadow banking. But the consequence of that is that you now have some collapses in listed companies or even failures and credit defaults, which you didn't have like 18 or 24 months ago. So the financial situation in China is not alarming yet. Probably it's cleaning up. That's probably positive, but it might be going faster than what was intended.
And on the other hand, you have the US thinking, well, we've got 3.1% growth. So yes, our farmers may take a bit of a hit, but otherwise we can tough it out.
Yeah, I certainly think, for instance, a lot of manufacturers, especially for soybeans, are hard hit by the tariffs. But at the same time, we have to think about consumers, especially Chinese consumers in China, and how that has affected them, particularly when it comes to higher prices, both on the Chinese side and both on the American side. So for many Chinese citizens, I think this certainly solidifies sort of a nationalist resentment against America, particularly when it comes to the Huawei ban. So what that translates to is more support for Chinese homegrown companies such as Huawei or Lenovo. So it certainly also leads to boycotts of certain American products such as Apple.
Yeah, but in that battle, I'm afraid, but probably the Chinese business needs the U.S. counterpart business more than the other side. Of course, the U.S. business needs a Chinese market, but the U.S. industry can survive without the Chinese support, technical.
Are you surprised, Jean-Claude Beaujour, by these reports that the Chinese economy has proven more vulnerable than first thought when it comes most notably to these chips in computers?
I'm not surprised because I think still the Chinese industry need more technology, and they need the U.S. technology to move forward. And I think in that way they are much more vulnerable. On the other side, I would also say something. In the U.S., I think President Trump made it clear. I think it's just the right time because he knows he has 1 year election going on, and he has the support of a large majority of his Republican voters. So he will be tougher and tougher on the U.S.-Chinese trade business.
So what do you do if you're Xi Jinping?
Well, I think it's hard to negotiate as if you're Xi Jinping because a lot of times we don't know what the end game is for the American side. We see sort of discontent.
Oh, really? Because in the past, people thought, oh, the Chinese are tough to negotiate with. Now you're describing the Americans that way.
I think there is a sort of discord between the Trump administration and a lot of the negotiators and arbitrators or the diplomats on the Chinese front. So it really is pretty difficult if you're Xi Jinping to actually predict what the American side would want to do. I think Trump himself doesn't necessarily understand what these tariffs mean in the long term, especially when it comes to for both the economies.
All right, so the Americans have become the unpredictable ones in negotiating. We'll pick up on that point and on the one you just made about what Trump's designs are. When we come back, you're watching the France24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France24 debate, and we're looking at a G20 summit that's set to be dominated by the United States and China. With us to talk about it from Brussels, journalist Ya-Chun Wang. Welcome back as well to Jean-François Di Meglio, president of the Asia Center here in Paris. Attorney Jean-Claude Beaujour is the vice president of the France-America Association, and Shaowan Shen, political science student, soon-to-be graduate, the American University of Paris, and president of the Singapore Student Association in Paris. You're a political science major, right?
Yes, I am.
Political science major. And you were telling us just before the break, Shaowan, that it's the sort of the unpredictability of the United States and the unpredictability of what Donald Trump wants that's at the heart of things. Now, we're not sure about Donald Trump, but what we do know is that his vice president, he seems very resolute, whether it's Huawei, the trade deficit, dumping. For Mike Pence, it's part of, quote, Chinese efforts to contest America's geopolitical advantages and trying to change their international order in their favor. He spoke last October before the Hudson Institute think tank.
We don't want China's markets to suffer. In fact, we want them to thrive. But the United States wants Beijing to pursue trade policies that are free, fair, and reciprocal, and we will continue to stand and demand that they do.
He used words that were a lot more aggressive than that at one point in his speech. For instance, he said Google should immediately end development of the Dragonfly app that will, as he put it, strengthen Communist Party censorship and compromise the privacy of Chinese customers. Very hawkish. So what does Trump want? Does Trump want a level playing field, or does he want to beat China?
That's a $24 question. I think Trump definitely wants to delay China's rise. China's rise is obvious. China's military buildup is obvious. Just to remind you, China is building the equivalent of French fleet every 4 years. Every 4 years, you're adding on a French military fleet in China. So that's the military buildup. You have military buildup everywhere. So that's what Trump wants to slow down. He cannot totally contain China's rise, and he probably needs China, you call it G20 or G2, he probably needs a counterpart. He realizes that the G1 is no longer the rule. But
it's no longer the Pax Americana.
Exactly. But conversely, as you rightly mentioned, he has elections in front of him. So whatever he says, which sounds hawkish, it's mostly designed at pleasing his potential voters more than anything else, because at the end of the day, there will be a deal. But the later the deal happens, probably the better it is for the voters, for Trump, and for his reasonably comfortable election.
Do you agree with that? Because
it's difficult to say we will have a deal with some result. Donald Trump knows that it's difficult to say this is the real result. You will have a deal. You will sign a paper. You will sign a political paper. But it will be difficult to say who is the winner, because they will ask you where is the financial, economic result, how far is your trade. I do believe that it's obvious, I agree, obvious that there's a race between the US and China to gain who is going to be the superpower in the next 20 years. And this is a real question. So behind the trade problem, there are this race, and on the basic stuff, the US are asking for fair trade into the Chinese market, market access.
But as we heard from Mike Pence, there's a contradiction. On the one hand, they're asking for fair trade, as you put it, market access.
Right.
Don't stop it with the dumping.
With subsidiaries.
With subsidies and disguised subsidies. And on the other hand, it's there's this will to beat China.
But this is a political statement. I think at this time, Pence is talking to his voters.
All right, it's not just Pence's voters. It's not just Republican voters. Beijing might be tempted to ride the storm and see who wins the U.S. presidential election in 2020. That doesn't necessarily mean Washington will then ease up if a Democrat wins. In Wednesday's first Democratic Party primary debate, the candidates at one point were asked what they saw as the biggest threat to their country.
Yeah.
Two threats, economic threat, China, but our major threat right now is what's going on in the Mideast with Iran if we don't get our
try to
act
keep
together.
it at one. China and climate change.
China, without a question, they're wiping us around the world economically.
Sawan Shen, your reaction to what we heard from Democrats. And Democrats, by the way, some of them at the center, some of them at the left of the party. Donald Trump's not alone.
Yeah. It's certainly true that a lot of Democrat candidates, I think the majority of the U.S. population believe that China is a threat to the world liberal order in one sense. But at the same time, I think that kind of line of reasoning wouldn't work with China as well. You know, China has, for instance, has to sort of save face in a way. And a lot of the demands that the United States are demanding, for instance, structural change to the economy, technological transfers to stopping the technological transfer to American firms are certainly hard line, red lines that China cannot cross. And
I find it's amazing. They all answer China is the biggest threat. If I were a Democratic candidate, I would say the biggest threat to U.S. economy is Donald Trump. That's their job. They're just not doing their job. I'm not saying that Donald Trump is the biggest threat to the U.S. economy, but if you are European and you look at the U.S., what you usually hear in Europe about Trump is that he's a big threat to the U.S. economy. That's the common language in Europe, and I'm so surprised that Democratic candidates wouldn't say so. That tells a lot about the gap between European opinion and U.S. opinion.
The fact is, the U.S. population, I spent part of my life in the U.S. The U.S. population is really convinced by the fact that China is afraid, and you're already saying that.
But to speak journalistic parlance here, is this a business story or a politics story?
I think it's both. You do have people saying it's the entire U.S. population say, "Oh, we are afraid of China," and you will realize that the Democratic candidates were really silent within the past few weeks when you have big fight between the U.S.
It's true that, for instance, for the American population, there is concern that economic growth, especially for rural Americans in the South or the Midwest, haven't been able to reap the effects of globalization in the past decade. So I think there is sort of a populist movement in one sense with Donald Trump, but there is valid concern that for these populations, they don't necessarily enjoy any of the free trade that has been going around for the past decade or so. So it certainly, there is a reason why Donald Trump is in office.
This is, Yachong Wang, this is a strange Cold War we're describing, if it is one, because here you have countries that do a lot of business, whereas when it was the Soviet Union, of course, the US and the Soviet Union barely did any business at all, in fact. And you have this leveraging of business interests. Do you agree when you hear Jean-Claude Beaujour say that it is both a business and a politics story?
I absolutely agree that there's a lot of business interest that goes into this talk, and I think we've all been right that in the United States, the talk. What people's perspective on China, it has been a lot in between friendly or unfriendly, and I think nowadays more and more that
Yachun, let's give a concrete example here. Huawei, is it a business rivalry or a security threat?
I personally think that what you see in the media most of the time, it is more about security. But I think if you go down to the business, really, if you dig in what's behind the media, I would say it's more about business, because if you look at the chips, if you look at Verizon, if you look at all of the things that Reuters, AFP has been talking about the Huawei dispute, it's a lot about global business. However, if you just see it on the surface, it is a lot about telecom communication security, cybersecurity. So I think there is, if you flip the same, it's both sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
This Thursday, we have news, Yachun Wang, out of Taiwan, where they vetoed a $2 billion bid by a Hong Kong developer to build these twin skyscrapers in Taipei, citing, quote, national security concerns, saying the company's too heavily influenced by mainland China. Your thoughts again about, this murky, blurred relationship between politics and business?
Yeah, I think it's important not to mix Hong Kong, China, and Taiwan, China as the same story. I think they're two very different situations. And I think Taiwan, in the midst of this Hong Kong protest against the extradition bill, I think Taiwan is getting really panicked about what is going to happen. What does this mean to Taiwan after all? So I think well, personally, I think the rejection of this bill from Taiwan, it's on the surface is very much about concern of security threats, but I think also that the large investment coming from China in the past decade has always been on the back of the nerves of Taiwanese people as well as current Taiwanese politicians. So I think you cannot simply see this as just a business deal that failed.
Jean-François Di Meglio, at this G20 summit that's coming up, you're going to see the French president who will be meeting Xi Jinping for the first time since, that French ship, the Dixmude, sailed through the Spratly Islands, which are disputed as whether or not they're international waters or not. There was really a spike in tension between China and France. We've had Canada as well facing off with China over territorial waters. Again, is this what seems like a business story turning more and more into a political story?
No, it's a political story. It's a French habit. It's a French tradition that at least once a year or twice a year, our ships do sail through the South China Sea and sometimes through the Taiwan Straits. As you recall, early April, the Vendémiaire, which is an older ship than the Dixmude, was forced to go back to her base, as opposed to the direction she was taking towards Qingdao, where there was a big parade. So the tone is definitely rising from the Chinese side. What is it related to? Possibly with a slight twist in the French attitude in the region. If you take the speech by our Ministry of the Armies in Shangri-La's dialogue earlier this month.
Yeah, there was that big meeting of defense ministers there.
It was a very vocal speech, and actually the speech was even more vocal than what was expected.
So the French are siding with the Americans?
That's the point. The speech was more aligned than expected to with the US position, whereas French interests are purely freedom of navigation and also the French interests in the region. One of the reasons why China is probably raising the tone is because France, as opposed to the past, is insisting more and more, stressing more and more France's interest in Indo-Pacific, as we say. We used not to speak about Indo-Pacific, which is basically different from Asia-Pacific, although it's the same region. But when you say Asia-Pacific, you have China in your mind. When you say Indo-Pacific, you just seem to put China
seems to shift a little bit
southwards. Of course, we cannot ditch China from the landscape. But when you say Indo-Pacific, that is irking China a little bit.
Are the French being naive if they try to limit it to simply a question of maritime routes? This isn't at all about. We have four mobile operators in this country. Yeah. Two of them are partnered with Huawei. So
I think we are not naive. I think the French government is try not to overreact and know that they will have to negotiate with all parties in order to protect its interests. So I don't really think they are naive. I think we try to be careful.
What do you think of the French attitude in all of this?
Well, it's certainly true that there are concerns regarding Huawei and there's spying in civilians. But at the same time, I think you can accuse the United States of double standards because they have been, there are concrete proof that the Americans have done spying in civilians of other countries as well. So it's certainly double standards when we talk about Huawei's partnership with French telecoms as well.
All right. The French president who has taken aim at a host of issues as he's been landing in Japan, and one of his red lines is climate change. This after a report that Japan, in an effort to placate the Trump administration, would water down the final G20 communique.
If we end with a text that's too vague because one or other country in the club doesn't want to move forwards, we'll be held hostage, if you will, of the most timid or those who believe in isolationism.
Leak by the Financial Times?
Yes, it was. And here he's talking about...
Exactly, yeah.
Here he's talking, though, about being held hostage, not by China, but by the United States. What does that tell you, Jean-François Dimeglia?
Well,
I mean, he doesn't say the United States, but it's clear that's who he means.
Well, yes. We don't have the final communique yet, so we've got to take what we saw, and in what we saw, the key words from the Paris summit in 2015 are just missing. Whereas we know that, of course, the general background of that is an environment which is. Of course, going worse and worse, and environmental issues less and less addressed by countries. Japan, is not doing badly in terms of environment. So it's quite surprising that if the communique is such as we saw, they would push for such a communique. We all know that, of course, they have a trade issue with the US. They are not. They are very concerned about what can happen to them in the trade discussions with the US.
According to the article in the Financial Times, Shinzo Abe wants Donald Trump to sign the communique. We remember the other time when he did not, back in Canada.
That was in Canada, yes.
Yeah. So when you're looking at it more broadly, the issue at hand, the environment, is that something that's kind of forgotten in all of this?
No. Well, you may say as well that you have the COP. There will be a new COP this year. There is an important COP in China. This is a COP 15 on biodiversity. So the debates are still going on, and this is possibly not necessarily the G20's duty to address those. But of course, this tells a lot about the Japan-US linkage and relationship which China should pay attention to.
Jean-Claude Beaujeu?
I think this is a way for President Macron to take the lead on that question. Of course, President Macron has a majority, political majority, in which he has a green members in his majority. But on top of that, I think he knows that China is quite sensible on that question. And he also knows that the US cannot stay too far, although the US decided not to be part of the treaty, but he also knows that there is a vast majority in the United States, including Republicans, who are in favor of protection of environment. So I really believe that here Emmanuel Macron takes the opportunity to have the lead on that subject and in front of the world.
Do you agree with this, Ya Chonwang, this spirit of multilateralism that we saw when the G20 convened a decade ago in response to the financial crisis? When it comes to the environment, when you listen to Jean-Claude Beaujeu, it's still there.
I really hope that we could, and I do think that it is too early to say anything concrete that the United States has already dominated how the dialogue is going to go. I think we all know Donald Trump's style. He likes to speak very loudly, but in reality, his action doesn't always carry through as strong as his words. And I do think that, for example, the president of France, Macron, he has made it very clear yesterday about his red line. He said that if his red line gets stepped over, he is not going to continue any dialogue. And I think I think it is his chance to take the lead this time, and especially now in the EU hub, he's not doing so well with his German neighbor, and I think that it will be very good to see them being united on the environmental issues. And also, we could probably all agree that the United States doesn't have so much positive position on this since they withdraw from the Paris Agreement, and in fact, China is doing much better in terms of limiting their carbon emission in comparison to the United States. We can just simply look at the per capita. We can simply look at how they are already a step ahead of their promise of switching to 30% of renewable energy by 2030. They are doing quite well, and I would think that if the G20 do put focus on environmental issues, China will be very happy.
All right, Donald Trump, who has made it clear he's not a big fan of multilateral institutions, and he's not only taken aim at China on trade. In the past days, he's bashed Vietnam, he's bashed the European Union, he's also bashed India, putting out a tweet where he said, "I look forward to speaking with Prime Minister Modi about the fact that India for years, having been put very high tariffs against the United States, just recently increased the tariffs even further. This is unacceptable, and the tariffs must be withdrawn!" Exclamation point. What do you make of it all, Xiao and Jen?
Well, I think the United States, the actions that the United States have taken over has been certainly very extreme in terms of cornering what they are essentially their keystone trade partners. And
are they? I mean, do you see this as really a threat by the leader of the world's biggest superpower, or a bit of entertainment?
No, I think it's
you take it seriously.
No, I think it's a little bit of both. You know, Donald Trump has to speak to voters in the United States, especially with the elections coming up as well. But I think there are a lot of concerns that these tariffs, even though it could be a device for rhetoric, is certainly damaging the economy in a lot of ways.
Jean-Claude Bourgeois, has it made you rethink what's an ally? What's a...
Yeah, for sure. I think now with Donald Trump, it's much more America first or America whatsoever, not the transatlantic alliance. However,
but he's not alone.
And alone, and he acts as the U.S. was the only nation. For me, the most important point here is, unfortunately, the international organization, World Trade Organization, are quietly silent on that matter. And this is proves that we fail about organizing the international trade and regulation.
That's an important point, because the Europeans have been arguing, Jean-François Di Meglio, that to solve these trade disputes, you really need a reform of the rules of world trade, of the World Trade Organization in particular, instead of these one-on-one bashing sessions.
Yeah, definitely there is a need to rebuild the organization. The point is, you were speaking about what's an ally. China is playing a big role in redefining the alliances. You used to have very well-defined alliances, and now you have opportunistic alliances. So in a way, Trump and China are not that much different. You said Trump is unpredictable. China used to be unpredictable, but now is predictable. Yet there is a common point. They both tend to destroy what is a structured alliance and replace this by opportunistic alliance.
The U.S. accused the Chinese of debt diplomacy, of getting countries, making countries beholden to them by loaning them money they can't pay back.
For example. Yet this probably is changing with China. Is probably realizing that you cannot just lend money alone and then negotiate the restructuring when it's needed just by yourself. They understand that they have to enter into more multilateral discussions about restructuring debt. So that might be changing.
In 30 seconds, what's going to be the outcome of this G20?
Well, first of all, as you said, if there is an outcome, it's better than what we saw in the previous sessions. So Abe has a big job, and remember, Macron said that he wants G20 and the G7, which is taking place in France, to be linked up together. So the outcome is probably what we will see at G7, and hopefully a relation between what's coming out of G20 in the G7 in Biarritz later this year.
The G7 to be taking place in Biarritz, France in August. Many thanks, Jean-François Di Meglio. I want to thank as well Jean-Claude Bonjour, Xiaowan Shen, and I want to thank Yachun Wang for joining us from Brussels. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 Debate.